Blood is thicker than water, but greed poisons both. When a multi-million-dollar estate was ruthlessly hijacked by two arrogant stepbrothers, the rightful heir was left with nothing but a rusted, beat-up 1984 Volvo. They laughed as he drove away, but they didn't know what was hidden in the trunk. The offices of Harrison Ross and Associates on State Street in downtown Albany smelled exactly like old money and new secrets, a suffocating blend of lemon furniture polish, expensive leather bindings, and stale espresso. Charles Harrington sat at the far end of the massive mahogany conference room table, his hands folded tightly in his lap. At 34, Charles was a high school history teacher who lived comfortably but modestly in a second-floor apartment in Troy, New York. He looked entirely out of place in his off-the-rack grey suit, especially compared to the three people sitting across from him. There was Brenda, his late father's second wife, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Flanking her were her two biological sons, Preston and Cameron Davis. Charles's stepbrothers were a study in unearned arrogance. Preston the elder wore a bespoke navy pinstripe suit that cost more than Charles's car, while Cameron sat back with his arms crossed, checking his phone with casual indifference, the heavy gold face of his Audemars Piguet watch flashing in the overhead lights. At the head of the table sat Mitchell Ross, a senior partner at the firm, and Richard Harrington's personal attorney for over 2 decades. Richard had been a titan of upstate New York real estate. What started as a single hardware store in the late 1980s had blossomed into Harrington Commercial Properties, a massive portfolio of strip malls, boutique hotels, and luxury apartment complexes spanning from Saratoga Springs down to the Hudson Valley. When Richard died of a sudden massive coronary thrombosis 2 weeks prior, the business world mourned a shark. Charles mourned the father he had spent the last 15 years trying to save from the isolation of his own wealth and from the claws of his new family. Mitchell Ross cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he broke the silence. We are gathered here today for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Richard Wyatt Harrington. I will dispense with the standard legal preambles and move directly to the distribution of the estate as stipulated in the document dated just 6 months ago. Charles felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. 6 months ago. That was right after his father had suffered his first minor stroke, a time when Brenda had severely restricted Charles's access to the Saratoga estate, citing doctor's orders to avoid stress. To my wife, Brenda Harrington, Ross read his voice, a dry, practiced monotone. I leave the primary residence located on North Broadway in Saratoga Springs, fully unencumbered, along with the sum of $4 million in liquid assets held in trust at J.P. Morgan Chase. Brenda let out a soft, theatrical sigh, nodding bravely. To my stepsons, Preston and Cameron Davis, I leave equal controlling shares of Harrington Commercial Properties, LLC, encompassing all real estate holdings, active development contracts, and subsidiary holding companies. You are to assume immediate executive control of the board. Charles's breath hitched. The entire company. His father had built that company from the ground up, and Charles had spent his teenage summers pouring concrete and painting drywall for his dad's earliest projects. Preston and Cameron hadn't known a hard day's work in their lives. They had simply slid into executive vice president roles after graduating from private business schools paid for by Richard. Cameron didn't even look up from his phone, a faint, smug smirk playing on his lips. Preston leaned forward, feigning gravity. It's a heavy burden, Mitchell, but Cameron and I are ready to honor Richard's legacy. There is one final provision, Ross continued, looking up over the rim of his glasses. He seemed briefly uncomfortable, a flicker of genuine pity crossing his aged face before he masked it with professional detachment. He looked directly at Charles. To my biological son, Charles Wyatt Harrington. Ross read, I leave the 1984 Volvo 240DL station wagon currently parked behind the maintenance shed at the Saratoga property. It is my deepest hope that he finds the same utility in it that I once did. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Then Cameron laughed. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a short, sharp bark of pure mockery. A 40-year-old rust bucket, Cameron sneered, pocketing his phone. Well, Tommy, I guess that teacher's salary won't be taking a hit for premium gas, will it? Cameron, please. Show some respect, Brenda chided lightly, though the corners of her mouth twitched upward. Richard always knew Charles was practical. Charles stared at the polished wood of the table. He didn't care about the billions. He never had. He had his students, his books, his quiet life. But this felt like a targeted humiliation, a final slap in the face orchestrated from beyond the grave. The 1984 Volvo was the car Richard drove when Charles was a boy, before the money, before the empire. It was the car they had taken camping in the Adirondacks, leaving him only that, while handing an empire to the stepsons who despised him, felt like a deliberate erasure of Charles's place in his father's life. Is that all, Mr. Ross? Charles asked, his voice steady, despite the roaring in his ears. That is the entirety of the will, Charles. I'm sorry, the lawyer replied softly. Preston stood up, buttoning his jacket. Will Mitchell draw up the transfer paperwork for the LLC? Tommy, you can come by the estate this afternoon to collect your inheritance. Try not to leave oil stains on the driveway. I just had the cobblestones power washed. Charles stood, pushing his chair in meticulously. He didn't look at his stepbrothers. He didn't look at Brenda. He simply walked out of the mahogany room, the echo of Cameron's laughter following him down the hallway. The Saratoga Springs estate was a sprawling, gated monstrosity of limestone and glass, a stark contrast to the modest homes Richard had built his fortune on. Charles parked his 2012 Honda Civic on the street outside the iron gates. He refused to give the security guard the satisfaction of denying him entry, and walked the half-mile up the winding, meticulously manicured driveway. He didn't go to the main house. He walked the perimeter, heading past the pristine tennis courts and the glass-enclosed pool house until he reached the overgrown patch of land behind the groundskeeper's maintenance shed. There it sat. The 1984 Volvo 240DL was a ghost of Charles's childhood. Its once vibrant, oceanic blue paint had faded to a chalky, sun-bleached grey. Deep, ugly blooms of orange rust ate away at the wheel wells and the bottom edges of the doors. The tires were half deflated, and a thick layer of pine needles covered the windshield. It looked like garbage. It looked exactly like how Charles felt. The estate's groundskeeper, an older man named Hector who had always been kind to Charles, was waiting by the car. He handed Charles a single silver key attached to a faded plastic dealer tag. I put a fresh battery in her this morning, Tommy, Hector said, his voice thick with unspoke sympathy. And aired up the tires. She's rough, but she fired right up. Your dad, he had me move it out here about 3 months ago. Told me to throw a tarp over it and forget about it. Thanks, Hector, Charles muttered, taking the key. It felt unnaturally heavy in his palm. He opened the heavy, boxy door. The interior smelled intensely of old vinyl dust and a faint, lingering hint of his father's old pipe tobacco. The driver's seat was cracked yellow foam spilling out from the seams. Charles slid behind the wheel, inserted the key into the ignition, and turned it. The engine cranked, sluggishly coughed, and then roared to life with a loud, rattling exhaust leak that shattered the quiet of the estate. Charles put it in gear and slowly drove the rattling, squeaking station wagon down the long driveway. As he passed the main house, he He saw Preston standing on the second-floor balcony, holding a tumbler of scotch. Preston raised his glass in a mocking toast as Charles chugged past the gates and onto Route 9. The drive back to Troy was agonizing. The Volvo's suspension was completely shot, making every pothole feel like a collision. The speedometer needle bounced erratically between 40 and 60, and the radio was completely dead. To make matters worse, as Charles merged onto Interstate 87 South, the sky bruised purple and unleashed a torrential, blinding downpour. He was just passing Exit 8 in Clifton Park when the steering wheel violently jerked to the right. A deafening flap, flap, flap echoed through the cabin. "Perfect," Charles shouted over the engine noise, wrestling the heavy car onto the muddy shoulder of the highway. Absolutely perfect. He killed the engine and sat in the silence, the rain drumming furiously against the thin metal roof. A right rear blowout. He rested his forehead against the cracked steering wheel, the weight of the day, the grief of losing his father, and the absolute humiliation of the will finally breaking over him. He sat there for 10 minutes, letting the tears fall in the cold, damp cabin. Finally, he wiped his face, zipped up his jacket, and stepped out into the freezing rain. The cars on the interstate roared past, kicking up massive sprays of water as Charles waded through the mud to the rear of the wagon. He shoved the key into the trunk lock. It was stiff with disuse. He jiggled it, cursed, and slammed his fist against the metal until the lock finally gave way. The heavy tailgate lifted on squeaking pneumatic struts. The trunk was empty, save for a frayed grey carpet. Charles pulled up the carpet to access the spare tire well underneath. He found the old rusted jack and a donut spare tire that looked like it had been sitting there since the Reagan administration. He heaved the heavy spare out of the compartment, tossing it onto the wet grass. As he reached back in to grab the tire iron, his knuckles scraped against the bottom of the wheel well. He paused, the freezing rain matting his hair to his forehead. The bottom of the tire well was completely flat. Volvo 240S didn't have flat tire wells. They had a deep, curved basin to hold the full width of the tire. Charles tapped his knuckles against the metal. It didn't sound hollow. It sounded thick, heavy, and solid. Frowning, Charles wiped the mud and water from his eyes and looked closer. The edges of this floor were sealed with a crude, sloppy line of metallic cork. It wasn't factory work. It looked like it had been welded and sealed in a hurry. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable surge of adrenaline, Charles grabbed the heavy steel tire iron. He wedged the sharp, flattened end into a tiny gap between the false floor and the chassis wall. He leaned all his weight onto the iron. The metal groaned. He adjusted his grip, planted his wet boots against the bumper for leverage, and pulled with all his might. With a sharp snap, the cork gave way. The heavy steel plate popped upward. Charles tossed the tire iron aside and wedged his fingers under the plate, heaving it backward. It flipped over, revealing a hidden compartment that took up the entire rear undercarriage of the station wagon. Charles stopped breathing. The cold rain pouring down his back was forgotten. Lining the bottom of the hidden compartment were 3 olive-drab military surplus ammunition boxes. Next to them sat a pristine, combination-locked leather briefcase and a vacuum-sealed plastic bag containing a thick, dark leather ledger book. With trembling hands, Charles reached down and unlatched the first heavy ammo box. He flipped the lid open. Inside, gleaming dully in the grey afternoon light, were rows upon rows of solid gold coins. They were 1-ounce South African Krugerrands, neatly stacked in clear plastic tubes. There had to be hundreds of them. His heart hammering against his ribs, Charles opened the second box. It contained 6 heavy velvet jeweler's pouches. He opened one and tipped it into his palm. A pristine, vintage Rolex Daytona Paul Newman chronograph slid out its stainless steel case, flawless, the kind of watch that commanded hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction. The other pouches held similar horological treasures, vintage Patek Philippes and Vacheron Constantin. "Dad," Charles whispered into the storm. He reached for the vacuum-sealed bag, tearing through the heavy plastic to pull out the leather ledger. Slipped just inside the front cover of the book was a plain white envelope with his name Tommy written on it in his father's jagged, unmistakable handwriting. Next to the envelope, taped to the inside cover of the ledger, was a sleek Kingston USB flash drive. Charles tore the envelope open. The paper inside was thick, the ink slightly smudged. "Tommy, if you are reading this, my heart has finally failed, and Brenda's boys think they have won. I am so sorry for the spectacle of the will. I had to make them believe they had outsmarted me. I had to make them think I was senile and defeated. 3 years ago, I discovered that Preston and Cameron had been systematically embezzling from the company. They didn't just steal. They created fraudulent shell companies, took out massive illegal loans against my properties, and funneled millions into offshore accounts at Cayman National Bank to avoid taxes. If I had confronted them or gone to the authorities while I was alive, they would have destroyed the company, tied the estate up in litigation for decades, and left you with nothing but legal fees. Worse, they managed to blackmail my doctors and Mitchell Ross. Ross isn't just an executor. He's an accomplice. They forced me to sign that new will under the threat of framing you for their financial crimes. They had fabricated documents with your forged signature, ready to hand over to the FBI. But they don't know about the Volvo. They don't know this car was registered through a dead LLCI created 30 years ago. It bypasses probate entirely. The gold and the watches in this trunk are worth roughly $6 million. That is your true inheritance, clean and untraceable. But more importantly, my son is the ledger in your hands and the USB drive attached to it. It contains every wire transfer, every forged signature, and every piece of evidence needed to put Preston Cameron Brenda and Mitchell Ross in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. Take the money, Tommy, and then take them down. I love you, Dad." Charles stood on the side of the rain-swept highway, staring at the letter until the ink began to blur from the raindrops. He looked down at the staggering fortune hidden in the rusted belly of the worst car in the world. The Stepbrothers had taken the empire, the mansion, and the pride. They had left him with a joke. But as Charles carefully packed the ledger, the letter and the gold back into the hidden compartment, a cold, hard smile touched his lips. He slammed the trunk shut, the heavy metal locking into place like a vault door. The joke was on them, and the punchline was going to be devastating. The cold rain stung Charles's hands as he wrestled the rusted lug nuts onto the spare tire. It took him 40 grueling minutes to secure the donut wheel, his knuckles bleeding and his suit ruined. When he finally climbed back into the driver's seat of the Volvo, he was shivering violently, but his mind had never been sharper. The grief that had weighed him down all afternoon had burned away, replaced by a crystalline, icy resolve. He didn't drive back to his apartment in Troy. It was too exposed. Instead, he drove south to a secure private storage facility on Central Avenue in Colony. He paid for a climate-controlled drive-up unit in cash, pulling the Volvo inside and pulling the heavy corrugated metal door shut. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the unit, he systematically emptied the hidden compartment, transferring the gold Krugerrands, the vintage watches, the ledger, and the USB drive into 2 heavy canvas duffel bags. The next morning, Charles walked into the downtown Albany branch of TD Bank, looking like a man with a singular purpose. He rented their largest safe deposit box, securing the physical wealth his father had left him. But the real treasure was in his jacket pocket, the Kingston USB drive. Back at his apartment, Charles brewed a pot of black coffee, sat down at his modest desk, and plugged the drive into his laptop. What he found over the next 12 hours made his blood run cold. His father hadn't just suspected Preston and Cameron. He had hired a private forensic accounting firm out of Manhattan to track every dime. The drive contained thousands of pages of PDF documents, wire transfer receipts, and intercepted emails. There were the shell companies, Apex Holdings, LLC, and Hudson River Ventures, registered in Delaware, completely controlled by Preston. Charles found the exact dates and amounts where millions of dollars were siphoned from his father's legitimate construction budgets and wired directly to accounts at Cayman National Bank. Then came the blackmail file. Mitchell Ross, the esteemed senior partner, had been caught siphoning client trust funds to pay off massive gambling debts at casinos in Atlantic City. Preston and Cameron had discovered this and used it to force Ross into orchestrating the hostile takeover of the estate. There were even audio recordings. Richard had bugged his own study in the Saratoga house. Charles listened, his stomach turning, as Cameron's voice casually discussed fabricating wire fraud evidence against Charles to force Richard into signing the new will. If the old man doesn't sign, Cameron's voice hissed through the laptop speakers, we hand the fabricated signature cards to the feds. Tommy goes to prison for 20 years for embezzlement. Richard will sign to save his precious bastard. They were monsters, and they were currently living like kings. Over the next 3 weeks, Preston and Cameron made sure the local business press covered their every move. They announced a massive, heavily leveraged $50 million waterfront redevelopment project in Troy. Brenda was photographed dripping in diamonds at charity galas, playing the role of the tragic wealthy widow. They were arrogant, sloppy, and entirely convinced they had won. Charles knew local police wouldn't touch this. Mitchell Ross had too many judges and local politicians in his pocket. He needed a hammer that the Stepbrothers couldn't buy. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Charles walked into the heavily fortified FBI field office on McCarty Avenue in Albany. He didn't ask to speak to a desk clerk. He specifically requested Special Agent David Reynolds, a veteran of the White-Collar Crime Division, whose name Charles had found in his father's notes as a straight-shooter untouchable. Agent Reynolds, a solidly built man in his 50s, with tired eyes and a perfectly pressed suit, sat across from Charles in a windowless interrogation room. He listened with polite skepticism as Charles laid out the story. "Mr. Harrington," Reynolds said, steepling his fingers, "I understand you're upset about your father's will. Estate disputes get ugly, but accusing Mitchell Ross of extortion and your stepbrothers of a multi-million-dollar offshore embezzlement scheme, that requires more than just a feeling." Charles didn't say a word. He simply reached into his briefcase, pulled out a thick binder containing printed copies of the Cayman National Bank wire transfers, the Delaware LLC registrations, the audio transcripts, and the forged signature cards they had planned to use against him. He slid the binder across the metal table. Reynolds opened the cover. He read the first page, then the second. The polite skepticism vanished from his face, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a seasoned investigator. He looked up at Charles. The atmosphere in the room completely changed. "Where did you get this?" Reynolds asked quietly. "My father left it to me," Charles replied, leaning back in his chair. "He told me to take them down. I brought the digital copies on a secure drive, fully unencrypted. I assume you'll want to verify the IP addresses on those email headers." Reynolds slowly closed the binder, a tight, dangerous smile forming on his lips. "Mr. Harrington, I'm going to need you to cancel your classes for the rest of the week. We have a lot of work to do." 2 months later, the Saratoga Springs estate was bathed in the glow of 100 imported lanterns. Preston and Cameron were hosting a lavish Founders Gala to officially celebrate their new roles as co-CEOs of Harrington Commercial Properties and to break ground on their new waterfront project. The driveway was lined with Bentleys, Ferraris, and Mercedes-Benzes. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with trays of Dom Perignon and beluga caviar. Inside the massive ballroom, a string quartet played Vivaldi, while Albany's elite mingled. Brenda held court near the fireplace, sipping champagne, while Mitchell Ross stood by the bar looking incredibly pleased with himself. Preston stepped up to the microphone on the grand staircase, tapping his glass with a silver spoon. The room quieted, friends, partners, and esteemed guests. Preston beamed, his teeth shining under the chandeliers. Tonight we celebrate the future. My brother Cameron and I promised our late father that we would take this company to heights he could never have imagined. And with this new waterfront development, we are doing just that. To legacy. To legacy, the crowd echoed, raising their glasses. A beautiful speech, Preston. A voice echoed from the back of the room. The crowd parted. Charles stood in the double doors of the ballroom. He wasn't wearing an expensive tuxedo. He wore the same off-the-rack grey suit he had worn to the will reading. He looked calm, steady, and utterly out of place. Outside, visible through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the 1984 Volvo was parked diagonally across the front entrance, blocking in a row of luxury cars. It was still covered in rust, and a dark puddle of oil was actively forming on the pristine cobblestones. Preston's smile vanished. Cameron's face darkened with instant fury. "What the hell are you doing here, Tommy?" Cameron hissed, marching toward him. "Security is supposed to be working the gate. Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." "I was just admiring the renovations," Charles said loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear him. He walked casually toward the center of the room. "You've spent a lot of money lately, Cameron. Tell me, how are the accounts holding up at Cayman National Bank? Is Apex Holdings yielding good returns?" The color drained instantly from Cameron's face. He stopped dead in his tracks. By the bar, Mitchell Ross dropped his champagne flute. It shattered on the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "I don't know what you're talking about," Preston stammered, stepping down from the stairs, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "You're drunk, Charles. You're upset about the will you forced him to sign under the threat of framing me for wire fraud." Charles countered, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The will Mitchell Ross notarized after you paid off his Atlantic City gambling debts with stolen client funds." Brenda gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Charles, stop this. Have you lost your mind?" "No, Brenda, I just found the trunk space in the Volvo," Charles said, with a cold, devastating smile. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of paper copies of the grand jury indictments. He tossed them onto a nearby cocktail table. "Dad kept the receipts. All of them." Preston lunged forward, his fists clenched, but before he could reach Charles, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open. "FBI, nobody move." A dozen federal agents in tactical gear poured into the room, their boots stomping against the marble. The string quartet stopped with a screech of bows. Guests screamed and backed away against the walls. Special Agent David Reynolds walked in behind his team, his badge gleaming on his belt. He looked directly at Preston and Cameron. "Preston Davis, Cameron Davis, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate embezzlement," Reynolds announced, his voice booming over the chaos. Cameron tried to run, bolting toward the kitchen doors, but two agents tackled him instantly, slamming him face first into the catering tables. Silverware and caviar rained down on him as they wrenched his arms behind his back and snapped the handcuffs shut. Preston didn't run. He just stood there trembling as an agent read him his rights and slapped the cuffs on his wrists. The bespoke navy pinstripe suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. Across the room, Mitchell Ross was hyperventilating, holding his hands out as an agent approached him. "I was coerced," Ross cried out, his dignified lawyer persona completely shattered. "They forced me. I have privilege. Tell it to the judge-counselor," Reynolds said dryly. Brenda wailed as agents escorted her sons out of the ballroom, parading them in front of the very high society they had tried so hard to impress. The flashbulbs of cell phones went off like strobe lights as the elite of Albany recorded their spectacular downfall. Agent Reynolds walked over to Charles. He extended a hand. "We have the warrants for the Cayman accounts and the offices. It's locked down, Mr. Harrington. The assets will be frozen, but with the evidence you provided, the estate will eventually revert to probate. You'll get it all back." "Thank you, Agent Reynolds," Charles said, shaking his hand firmly. "But I already have what matters." Charles walked out of the ballroom, leaving the chaos, the screaming, and the shattered crystal behind him. The cool night air felt incredibly clean. He walked down the steps, past the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles heading straight for the rusted 1984 Volvo. He climbed in the yellow foam of the seat, familiar and comforting against his back. The engine roared to life with its signature rattling cough. He put it in drive and slowly rolled down the driveway, leaving the estate behind. He had a fortune in gold sitting safely in a bank vault. He had his father's true legacy secured, and tomorrow morning he had a first-period history class to teach. Charles smiled, turned on the headlights, and drove the rusty station wagon into the night. If this story of absolute betrayal and brilliant cold-blooded revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell to catch more incredible true crime and real-life drama stories. Share this video with a friend and drop a comment below. Would you have kept teaching or retired instantly? Let us know.